Chapter 22. She came by here last night, Ida explained. Stopped by and wanted to borrow a few matches. She couldn't talk any English to speak of, but she makes out with sign language. Near as we can figure, she was starting for Hudson Bay, all alone with the baby and a team of dogs. Dad said it was coming on to snow and wouldn't let her go. The woman sat there smiling at them all, a trusting look in her slanting black eyes. "Well," said Sergeant McLeish, "if there's any way to let her know, it ought to be safe for her to go back home now. We chased those track Indians back to Nakina." "Let me talk to her," Miss Vanderbeck offered. "We sort of have an understanding each other. You men folks take off your things and get some dried out. Supper'll be ready in a few minutes." Jim took the dogs back to the kennels and unloaded the sled. While he was still outside, his brother joined him. "I'm going to harness her team," Lindsay said. "Ma got it over to her that she'll be all right at home, and she's starting back right away. Gee, boy, wish I had been with you when that big wolf came along. McLeish was telling us about it." The giant Scotman spent the night with them, and they were sorry to see him go in the morning. Naturally, a man of few words, he had unbent in the cordial atmosphere of the Vanderbeck household and entertained them with yarn after yarn. He took Jim's hand at parting, with a grip that made the boy wince. "They ought to pay you double bounty on that wolf," he grinned. "Killing him was worth a lot to the government. If you're willing to sell the pelt, I'd like to recommend to the officials in Ottawa or Toronto they have him mounted and be part of the exhibit." "I was planning on making a rug of it," said Jim, flushed with pleasure. "But if the government wants it, gee, that'd be swell, wouldn't it?" The sun was bright that morning, and the temperature was rising rapidly. When McLeish had left, Jim set about repacking his toboggan. "It'll be thawing by noon," he told the family. "I'll have to strike out for Squaw Lake right away if I want to get any supplies in camp this spring." He hitched up Bruno and Pat and put on his long snowshoes. In 10 minutes he was breaking trail northward on the Porcupine Lake route. From Porcupine he swung left towards the foot of the squaw, and by the time the snow had begun to melt, he was on the long south cove of the lake. When Jim reached camp, he lost no time in unpacking his spring provisions and getting to work on the wolf pelt. There was hardly any fat on the inside of the huge pelt, but he scraped it carefully, removing every shred of flesh. He was glad now that he had not taken time to cut off the great dangling paws when he stripped the carcass. He skinned them out now, taking out the bones as far as the toes and fleshing the thin, tough hide of the legs. Finally, he stretched the pelt over an immense frame of birch. It was a job that took him into late in the evening, but when he surveyed his handiwork, he was very well pleased. The morning was well advanced when he finished breakfast the next day. It was thawing already and too soft to travel with the dog. However, he was able to get around fairly well on snowshoes, and in the afternoon he started out to look up a brook that flowed into the lake near his camp. After 3 or 4 miles, the course of the little stream led him to a swampy muskeg pond. The surface looked treacherous. He skirted around it, through the bush, and continued to the inlet on the other side. Suddenly he saw open water before him. It came as a shock in the middle of this snow-bound landscape. A dark pool rippling in the breeze, with tiny curls and eddies of stream rising from its surface. Jim went closer and knelt beside it. He took off his mitten and put his hand in the water. To his amazement, it was warm, almost hot. The pool was nearly 20 feet across and round in shape. Bending down, he could see white sand bubbling in the bottom. A warm spring. Looking around him, the boy found hundreds of tracks mingled in the snow. Mink, otter, fisher, fox, rabbit, weasel, even deer had used the spring as a drinking place. For him, this discovery was what finding a vein of pure gold would be to a prospector. He would trap the place next winter. In the meantime, he wanted to stake his claim. With the point of his knife, he dug a deep J.V. in the trunk of the nearest large tree. That would warn anyone who came after him. He had prior right to the trapping there. Jim spent 2 more days exploring the country around camp. Very early in the morning of the 20th of April, he harnessed the dogs and set out down for Wapping. The weather had been so warm that he expected open water in the lakes and rivers soon, and he wanted to be ready to begin setting muskrat traps as early as possible. Ida was to come with him to cook and help with the trapping. When he finished the family's camp, he found Mary had already gone to join Lindsay at Poplar, and his older sister had her knapsack all packed, awaiting his arrival. They would be starting back next morning, but it snowed and rained all day and kept them housebound. Then the weather turned in the night, and there was a frozen crust that crunched under their snowshoes when they left the clearing at daybreak. With them they took only one dog, old Bruno, for company. He had no sled to pull, but the habit was so strong he still plodded along behind them, following the trail they broke. Ida had never seen the line camp at Squaw Lake. "My goodness, what an untidy mess," she exclaimed when Jim threw open the door. "I don't see how you men folk live when you're off by yourself like this all winter." "What's the matter with it?" asked Jim in surprise. "I picked up things special just before I came away." Ida laughed. "Well," she said, "I don't suppose it would bother a man, but wait till I get through straightening up. I bet you'll notice the difference. Go cut me some elder switches right off. No, I'm not going to spank you. I want to do some sweeping." Jim tied a bunch of alder switches together at the end of a stick and made a passable broom. As he watched his sister energetically brush up the dirt floor, an idea came to him. He said nothing to Ida about it, but before he turned in for the night, he sharpened his axe. Breakfast the next morning tasted better than usual, he had to admit. Ida certainly knew how to make a good coffee. When he was cleaning up the last of the flapjacks, he put on his outdoor clothes. "I'll be back for lunch," he told her, "going up back in the bush and cut some wood." That was true enough, though if she had noticed the huge pile of firewood beside the cabin, she must have thought it was an unnecessary chore. Jim selected a clump of tall, straight spruces and began operations. He felled and trimmed about 6 of them and split them with wedges and began smoothing the flat side with his axe. When they were level enough to suit him, he trimmed off an edge or two of the round surface and straightened the split edges. By night, he had some fairly respectable hewn lumber, a foot wide and 4 or 5 inches thick. That evening, while Ida was outside feeding the dogs, Jim got a long piece of string out of his possible sack and measured the length and breadth of the cabin. She came in before he expected her and caught him at it. "So that's what you've been up to," she laughed. "A grand idea, Jim. When do you want to begin putting it in? I'll help you move things." "Shucks," he said. "I was going to send you off on some expedition somewhere and surprise you. Still, I guess you can be some help at that. I'll cut off the planks the right length and we'll haul 'em down here tomorrow." When the new puncheon floor was in, the place really began to look neat and comfortable. But Jim didn't stop with the floor. While the carpenting spill was on him, he built some new table shelves, a cupboard for Ida's dishes, and a chair that could be sat in without causing a curvature in the spine. These operations occupied Jim's time for several days, but when they finished, he began to grow restless. He took a trip up to Sucker Lake, hoping to find open water. The ice was rotting fast, but there was no chance to set traps. Down Squaw River, the same conditions prevailed. Only the rapids and a few patches in the middle of the stream were clear. Day after day the sun shone warm, and the drifts melted in the woods. Every day there was a gurgle of running water seeping down from the high ground to swell the brooks. One bright blue morning, Ida called her brother to look at a great flock of ducks flying north. They were too high for him to distinguish what kind they were, but the sound of their quacking came thin and eerie of the sky. Jim wanted action at once. "See here," he said, pointing to the calendar Lindsay left on the wall. "It's the 1st day of May. Plenty late to start spring trapping, and those ducks know there's open water somewhere around here. Come on, let's go find it." He loaded his pack with a dozen traps and enough food to make lunch. As an afterthought, he took a light, jointed rod and stuck a trout fly or two in his hat brim. 4 or 5 miles down the squaw, they came to a long reach where the ice was entirely gone. It was still water, shoaled with marshy grass along the banks. Along the far shore, a V-shaped ripple was moving swiftly upstream. "Look at that," breathed Jim. "There goes a rat now." He laid out his trap on the snowy bank and started operation. He had put on his mucklucks this morning. They were high moccasins of sealskin made somewhere north of Hudson Bay. Worn for spring trapping, they were always warm and completely waterproof. The only precaution necessary with mucklucks was to keep them from freezing. Exposed to too low of temperatures, the soft hide grew brittle and cracked. Jim waded into the shallows among the dead grass stems and found a drift log lying with one end out of the water. Just at the edge, where the ripples lapped, he cut a notch wide enough to hold a number 1 trap and deep enough so that the pan would be level with the surface of the log. The end of the chain was fastened to the log with a common fence staple, and the set was ready. A muskrat trap needed no bait. Its success depended on placing it where the animal will step into it. In the first days of open water, every rat is looking for logs, fallen trees, or rocks where he can crawl out and sun himself, and Jim took advantage of all the natural spots of this kind along the shore where he set his traps. At 1 or 2 places he fell a poplar so that the trunk would lie half in the water, and put the trap in a knot as he had on the drift log. When all the sets had been made, they still had an hour or 2 before lunch. "How about going up to the foot of the rapids," the boy suggested, "and finding out if the fish are hungry? Let's see. They oughtn't to be very fussy this time of year. Guess I'll try a spinner with a little parabelle fly." He put his rod together and tied on the leader. "Here goes," he called Ida. "First cast of the season." The line sang out sweetly, and the fly dropped with a tempting flicker on the edge of an eddy. It drifted only a yard or 2 when a big trout struck with a ravenous rush. The battle lasted 5 minutes, but the fish was too securely hooked to need much finesse. Ida was ready with the landing net. "2-pounder," panted Jim as the gleaming trout thrashed on the bank. "That's a good start. Here, you try a cast." When they lit the luncheon fire, there were 5 ready fish for the pan, and no royal feast ever tasted better than those fresh trout after a winter of dried moose meat and bacon. On the return trip to camp, they saw many cakes of rotten ice washing down the rapids. It was coming out of the lake fast, melting and breaking away under the May sun. "That means we can use the canoes by tomorrow if the weather stays warm. Gee, it'll be good to feel the swing of a paddle again." There was no freeze that night, and, after the mist had cleared, no cloud in the sky next morning. Ida helped Jim launch the canoe, which was on the rack behind the camp. They pulled down the fast water to a new stretch of open river below, and set more traps before lunchtime. Coming back with the white rush of rapids to fight, Jim found his pulling muscles woefully stiff from lack of use. It was always so in the first day or 2 of canoe travel. He knew he would limber up and recover his skill before the week was out. That afternoon he walked up the brook to Sucker Lake, and to his joy there was a large patch of open water offshore, and he began at once to construct a number of rat rafts. They were made of 2 good-sized logs deeply notched on the end. A pair of lighter sticks nailed crosswise held them in position, and a pole driven into the mud of the lake bottom kept them from floating away. Then a trap was set in each notch. Heavy clouds had gathered before Jim finished building the last of his 4 rafts. A low grumble of thunder rolled down across the bush. Hastily the boy placed the final trap and started for home. The storm held off until he was almost in sight of the cabin, then with a roar like artillery fire it let loose in earnest. He raced to the door and entered, with water sluicing off his hat and shoulders. Ida was humming cheerfully as she got supper. "Well," she grinned at him, "I do believe it's raining." The thunder ripped and bellowed through the woods, and the deluge shook the roof poles. "Raining," Jim snorted, when he could make himself heard. "It's pouring pitchforks, and look at that lightning. Well, I guess it proves that spring's really here."